Well, welcome to session 3 of a panorama of the Christian church. I'm really looking forward to what we're going to be talking about during the years between 800 and 1500 AD. A lot happened. The church dominated Western Europe. In some ways that was very positive. In some ways that had some drawbacks. So let's get started. Remember that we've been asking the question, what has God been doing all these years? Well, he's been fulfilling the promises that he made to his church, to us as his people. And so it gives us the opportunity to see how God has fulfilled his plan through his church and has changed the world and redeemed people to himself. So it's a great study. We've asked the question, why look backward at what God has been doing at all? Remember that the points that we've covered are that we are prone to repeat the mistakes of the past. If we don't learn from the past, we'll have to learn from our own bad choices. We often fail to see how God is fulfilling his promises, and we get discouraged because we think, well, God's not listening, God's not working. And yet he has been working. He just doesn't do it in the time frames that we have in mind sometimes. We also may be tempted to give up or to give in when our triumph is just around the corner. And we see how God has triumphed at the last minute over and over again in church history. And then we've made the point that all churches, especially interdenominational or non-denominational churches, may need this look backward to give perspective. So now let's get started. So continuing our review, what was God doing in the world between 33 and 313 AD? Well, he was establishing his church, like he promised. And they resolved key issues of how they were to live in the world and how they were to represent Jesus. They survived persecution and they began to spread the good news to the known world. Then what was he doing in the last session between 313 and 800 AD? Well, he was building his church as he promised he would. Remember, the church triumphed over Rome, became legal. The church clarified biblical doctrines. The finer points of doctrine, answered some questions that the Bible wasn't 100% clear on. The church survived the chaos of a collapsing empire. Rome collapsed in the 5th century, at least in the West it did. And the church began the process of converting the barbarian tribal groups in Europe and in North Africa as well. You see how the church grew from small beginnings in the Jerusalem area, and the orange blotches show the areas that were heavily Christianized by about 200 AD. The Roman Empire was heavily Christianized by 400 AD. And by 800 AD, you see that they had expanded in some areas and begun to lose ground in other areas. And that losing of the ground was in the conquests of Islam in North Africa and in the Middle East, as well as in Spain. So now, session 3, the dominance of the church, 800 to 1500 AD. Let's get started with that. Part 3, the dominance of the church from 800 to 1500 AD. Let's get started with that. I want to tackle a question that Christians sometimes ask about the Middle Ages. Many Christians are under the impression that Christianity kind of didn't exist in the Middle Ages. I mean, there has been all of this, I guess you'd say, feelings, at least in Protestant circles, that the Roman Catholic Church was completely off base, that there was nothing good to be offered in the Roman Catholic Church. So therefore, since the Catholic Church dominated the scene, at least in Western Europe, and there were really no alternatives except the Eastern Church over in Greece and Russia and places like that therefore Christianity really didn't have much to do with the Middle Ages. Well, I don't think that's entirely true. This is the time in which, in my opinion, the Roman Catholic Church began to push the limits of what was doctrinal, what was moral, what was ethical, and what was taught by Jesus and the apostles. So although the Roman Catholic Church was involved in many excesses, I don't think Christianity entirely disappeared out of the Roman Catholic Church at this time. So many have felt that talking about the church and Christianity in the Middle Ages is kind of off limits. They either don't know what to say about it or they're not sure that that's a valid topic. I think that's because people have an incomplete understanding about the time period. They don't really get the depth and the breadth of what was happening. They don't get the fact that the Roman Catholic Church was very conflicted, lots of different opinions and movements within the church, some more biblical than others. And as I said, some have taught that after the time of the apostles, the true church died out for hundreds of years and had to be restarted. That doctrine was widely spread in the early 1800s, especially in the United States. But I don't think that doctrine was really taught much before that or in other places. The Jehovah's Witnesses have taught that, the Mormons have taught that, and others, Church of Christ, tended to get started that way. Adventists also. But I don't think that comes from a complete understanding of what was going on at the times. And we're going to see that God always had his faithful people throughout the ages, including the Middle Ages. I mean, he said he would build his church as long as people were faithful. And I believe that there were always faithful people in the church, even if the institution had begun to get off the rails. Let's take this scripture as our guide for this period. 1 Kings 1, 38 through 39. It says, So Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet, Benaiah son of Jehoiada, the Kerethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon mount King David's mule, and they escorted him to Gihon. Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the sacred tent and anointed Solomon. Then they sounded the trumpet, and all the people shouted, Long live Solomon. So here you see church and state mingled. You have King Solomon as the ruler of the state, and you have Zadok the priest and others representing God's people. And here you see God's people and the state working together to form a righteous community, a righteous people. It can happen. It often goes astray, but it can happen, and there is biblical precedence for it. I don't know that we as an American people are capable of pulling it off, so that's why it's safer to have separation of church and state. But there's dangers with that as well. Anyway, let's use this text as our guide. During most of the Middle Ages, the church experienced a steady growth in wealth and power. The church's power eventually centered in the Vatican in Rome. The Vatican is one of the 7 hills of ancient Rome. It happens to be the hill on which St. Peter's Basilica is built, and it houses all the headquarters of the Roman Catholic Church. So the church began to more and more assume political power. Why? Because Rome had collapsed in the 400s. And when there's no government, somebody steps into the political vacuum. And in this case, the church was the institution that had the resources and the leadership to do that. So in some ways, very rightly, they stepped into the political gap and began to act as not exactly a government, but to run society. Well, the political powers eventually regained their feet. They weren't the old Roman political powers. They were the new barbarian kingdoms, the kingdom of Francia, which we call France, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and eventually the single Anglo-Saxon kingdom in England. The different Germanic kingdoms and the kingdoms in Spain, they all regained their feet. And so, but suddenly the church, now has political alliances, but it's not going to give up all of its power. It's used to having power. And so it begins to work with these rulers, sometimes to do good things, sometimes maybe not, but there's this union between them. For instance, the church reserved the right to crown and discipline rulers. For example, on Christmas Day in 800 AD, Pope Leo crowned his protector Charlemagne, king of the Franks, as Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne had bailed out the Pope. The Pope had been attacked by some Italian nobles. Charlemagne came to the rescue, saved him, and as a reward, the Pope crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. Basically said, take charge of all these little kingdoms all over Europe, the little kingdoms in Spain, the little kingdoms in Germany, the little kingdoms in England. Of course, he never did get to England, but that was the idea. Take control over this political chaos and make an empire out of it. Restore Rome, in other words. And that's exactly what Charlemagne intended to do. So this precedent of the church dominance over secular rulers was acknowledged by most nobility during the Middle Ages. Sometimes they would even discipline the nobility. Popes could threaten to excommunicate kings and dukes and other kinds of rulers if they didn't stay in line. And so the church had this power over the rulers. Charlemagne controlled an empire that stretched from northern Spain. Remember, Spain was dominated by Islam at this time, but there were still some Christian kingdoms in the north. And so he was able to help them against the Muslims and actually expand some of their territory. His empire extended all the way into central Germany, actually, and northern Italy. He used his political power to fight Islam in Spain and to convert pagan people in Central Europe to Christianity. This is all during the late 700s, early 800s. The church also provided internal options for Christian practice, and we're thinking at this point mainly of monasticism, monks and nuns. The first monks and nuns practiced hermit-style monasticism. They went out in the desert by themselves or out in the woods or someplace where they could be alone so that they could practice prayer and spiritual disciplines. But by the year 500, Benedict of Nursia, who was an Italian nobleman, believed that true Christianity has to be lived in community. You've got to have other people around you. How do you know how patient you are if you don't have other Christians around you? How do you know how righteous you are in terms of how you treat people if there are no people around to deal with? So he founded the first monastic community at Monte Cassino in Italy in 500 AD. And his rule, in other words, his guidelines for life as a monk in community, was that everybody had to work. Nobody got to goof off. Everybody had some job, mopping the floors, cooking the food, tending the sick, tending the livestock, whatever it might be. Everybody prayed daily. There were 7 times of prayer. They took the notion in the Bible that you pray without ceasing. They took that literally. They basically say you never say amen finally in any particular day because you're always saying, okay, God, we're praying. Now we'll take a break, but we'll be back in a few minutes. And so 7 times during the 24-hour period, they would pray. And then daily study. That there should be no such thing as an ignorant monk or nun. All of them got some reading and writing, some learning. Some were better at it than others, of course, but all of them participated. So what was the big appeal with monasticism? I mean, today most Americans and Westerners look at monks and nuns as kind of strange. But in the Middle Ages, it wasn't like that. Constantine's legalization of Christianity so many years before had resulted in what many called half-Christians. They were formerly Christians. They showed up at Mass or at church from time to time, but they really didn't live like Christians. And that included people in the church who were either poorly instructed, they didn't know much about what they believed, or they were insincere in their faith. They were just in it for other reasons. And there was also increased corruption in the church, and people in the church saw all of this. Those who wanted a pure pursuit of Christian life were sometimes attracted to monasteries and convents, because monasteries offered education and an orderly life, also a very predictable life. You got 3 square meals a day. You had something to do with your life. You were sort of safe in a monastery or a convent. And so it attracted a lot of people, especially in the situation where the older son inherited pretty much everything. Younger sons and sometimes unmarriageable daughters, the option was the monastery or the convent. So various religious orders were founded. The Benedictines were early on, from St. Benedict of Nursia in the 500s. But later on in the Middle Ages, other orders were founded. The Dominicans, who were very academic, very much into education. The Augustinians, the Franciscans, which were all about, helping people and living a life of poverty, as well as many others. The monks also always had sister orders. So you would have Benedictine monks, but you'd have Benedictine nuns, Dominican monks and nuns, and so on. Sometimes they weren't called that. I think the monks were called Franciscans, but I believe the nuns that were the sister order were called the Sisters of St. Clare. So the church suffered also during this time from internal disagreements and conflicts. There had been a growing conflict between Eastern Christians and Western Christians over a number of issues. And in 1054, those disagreements came to a head, in which both groups, the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church, finally split. Catholic means universal, so all of them would have called themselves Catholic. We're part of the universal church, the Catholic Church. But they had come to really disagree. For one thing, the Eastern churches always celebrated their services. They always had their services in the language of the people, either Greek or Russian or Syrian or whatever language it might be. The Roman Catholic Church in the West always insisted on the Latin Mass, even if people no longer spoke Latin, which they didn't after about the 5th century. They didn't really speak Latin anymore, so they weren't really understanding what was going on. The church headquartered in Rome insisted that the Pope was the head of the entire church and all bishops had to submit to him. The Eastern Church said, no, not really. We never really agreed to that. And they disagreed about some points of doctrine as well. So here are some of the points of doctrine that the church disagreed about. The use of statuary versus icons. Now, that's really not a doctrinal issue. But the Eastern Church uses icons, pictures, holy pictures. Maybe you've seen some of them. But the Western Church not only uses pictures, it uses statues. And the Eastern Church has always felt, as Protestants often feel, that statues are a little too close to idolatry, and that some of the more ignorant people in the Catholic Church might be tempted to worship the statue rather than what the statue represents. And so the Eastern Church said, well, we're not going for the statue part, and we don't agree that you're using those. We don't want to be part of your organization if you're going to use statues. They disagreed over the method of calculating the date of Easter. On some calendars, you will notice that there's a difference between Western Easter, which Catholics and Protestants celebrate together, and Eastern Easter, which is oftentimes a couple of weeks different than that. And then, of course, the claim of the Bishop of Rome to be supreme head of the entire Christian church. These were some of the differences. There were a few others as well, but it finally came to a head and they excommunicated each other, and the split has never been repaired. The church also faced external threats. Now, Islam began to spread in the previous period, during the 600s. It spread out of Saudi Arabia and all across Egypt and North Africa and up through the Middle East and into Turkey. It spread very rapidly. It caught the Christians off guard. People and areas that used to be heavily Christianized, like, for example, in North Africa, suddenly were confronted by Muslim armies. Many people converted to Islam, I suppose because they were afraid, or maybe because they just thought that was the thing to do. And so the Christian church lost a lot of lands and people to Islam. Places like Spain, Portugal, North Africa, and Turkey saw their Christian populations shrink and take on second-class status under Muslim rule. The Muslims didn't force Christians and Jews to convert, but you lost a lot of your rights. You couldn't have a high position in government usually, couldn't have a high position in the army. You couldn't convert any Muslims. Muslims could convert Christians, but Christians could not convert Muslims, and so forth. Christian men could not take Muslim women as wives, but Muslim men could take Christian women as wives, that sort of thing. So it was quite a shock. Here's the map of the area by 1000 AD. Look at how Christianity has spread all the way into Norway and Sweden and into Russia. And it still had Turkey at that time because the Turks had not quite arrived yet fully from Central Asia, Turkmenistan and places like that. But the purple areas are Islam in 1000. And so it was quite a shift. You'll see in Spain and Portugal there was something called the Reconquista, in which the Christians began to push south and conquer Muslim territory. And eventually they reunited Spain in the year 1492. Actually, February 1492, Spain was reunited as a Catholic country, just months before Queen Isabella sent Columbus off on his famous voyage of discovery. From 1095 to 1270, Christianity was in conflict with Islam in a very organized way. That organized way was called the Crusades. Now, the stated cause of the Crusades was that Muslims were oppressing Christians in the Holy Land. And the First Crusade released Jerusalem and surrounding territory from Muslim control, and it created Christian-controlled Crusader states in the Holy Land. There was the Kingdom of Jerusalem and several other little kingdoms in the area ruled by French knights. The First Crusade, from a European standpoint, was very successful. But all the other Crusades, and I think that most historians would number them at about 7, all the other 6 Crusades failed. Muslims regained complete control of the Holy Land by 1270. So it was a disaster. It caused lasting animosity on both sides. Not a good thing necessarily. The Eastern Church, however, faced a centuries-long struggle with Islam from 632 to the present. So the Eastern Christians have always been dealing with Islam. Western Christians, this is kind of a new thing for them. And in Spain and Portugal, the struggle between the northern Christian kingdoms and Islamic Al-Andalus, which was the name of that part of Spain and Portugal controlled by Islam, lasted from 711 to 1492. So 700 years or more was under, at least parts of the area were under control of Islam. The Spanish knight El Cid broke Muslim control around 1000 AD and began the Reconquista process, which ended some 400, almost 500 years later. Ferdinand and Isabel defeated the remaining Muslims in 1492 and united Spain under the banner of Catholicism. That's why Spain has always been such just a dramatically Catholic country, because it had spent so many years trying to find unity in the Catholic faith. The church invested heavily in education as well. Through the exploration and trade, the church interacted with scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians from other cultures. In some ways, Islamic scholars were far ahead of Christian scholars in the Middle Ages. They also brought some innovations from India, because the Muslims were trading with India and acting as middlemen between India and China and the Europeans. And so a lot of Indian concepts came through the Arabs and the Muslims. This was the time when the great universities were started, based upon this flowering of learning all over Europe that was based in the church, but incorporated things that the church had learned from other cultures as well: science, medicine, literature, all that kind of stuff. And Christian scholars developed something called the scholastic method of learning, and founded the great university systems like Oxford and Cambridge and Paris and Salamanca in Spain and other places. The great universities were founded as far back as the late 1100s and early 1200s. The University of Paris, also known as the Sorbonne, as well as Oxford and Cambridge universities, are well-known examples. And certainly the greatest scholar of the late Middle Ages was Thomas Aquinas. He was born in 1225 into a noble Italian family, and early in life joined the newly established Dominican order. In his long and highly academic career, he wrote many books and essays, most notably the great Summa Theologica, which was meant to be an in-depth explanation of the main teachings of Roman Catholicism. So the great university system begins during this time, and American educational system is a direct descendant of the European system founded during the Middle Ages. But then the church eventually lost power to secular rulers. This loss of power and prestige was caused by the rise of nationalism. People began to think of themselves less as, I'm a subject of Duke so-and-so or of Count so-and-so, and more, and more in terms of I'm a citizen of the Kingdom of France or of England. And so there was this growing national pride. There was disillusionment within the church. The Crusades showed that the church could be defeated. It showed that just because the Pope said that God wanted us to go and fight the Muslims didn't mean that the Pope was always right. And by this time, the church was vastly wealthy and powerful, and it was known to have abuses. For example, it was the wealthiest institution in Europe, and yet it continued to extract money from people for its great building projects. And people are saying, the church is already wealthy. Why do you need more money from us? Sometimes bishops and even local priests were known to have mistresses on the side and illegitimate children when they had taken vows of celibacy. People could buy a bishopric. You could, if you had a son that you wanted to make a bishop and you had enough money, you could buy a vacant bishop's chair and have them be the bishop of that area. So it was just a terrible situation. There was also this educational enlightenment going on where people were learning, and oftentimes people who were in this growing middle class realized that they were more educated than their parish priest or even than their bishop, and they began to think, well, why do I have to listen to what they say? Maybe I know more than they do. And of course, many kings were growing restless at the discipline and dominance of the local archbishop or the pope, and they wanted their freedom to do what they wanted to do. An example would be this person here, King Philip IV of France, who successfully challenged the authority of the Pope in 1303 and had the Pope imprisoned, and then eventually decided that he wanted his own Pope. And so for a period of time, there were two popes, one in Rome and one in France. And that, of course, caused confusion. People were looking at, which Pope do I listen to? Which Pope do I respect? So it was a very confusing time. As I mentioned, the church adapted to an expanding knowledge of the world. So as Europeans began to explore, and especially in the 1300s, 1400s, as the Portuguese began to sail around Africa, of course, Europeans knew that Africa was there. They just didn't know how far it went. And so, they wanted to get to India, but you had to go around Africa to get there. And it took the Portuguese quite a long time to slowly and carefully sail down the coast and find out how Africa went. And so the Portuguese eventually arrived in India, eventually arrived in China, places further east, and brought back all sorts of ideas and products that were available. And then, of course, after 1492, Columbus began to open up the Americas and began to bring back products and ideas from the Americas, as well as the Catholic Church immediately sent missionaries to convert the Native American peoples to the Catholic faith. So in the process, Christians were forced to interact with new ideas and circumstances. What do we do with these people? Are they people who can be converted? And if so, do we make them leaders and so forth? All of those questions. The Renaissance was a huge factor. The Renaissance began in the 1400s, lasted through the 1500s, and really the Middle Ages ended with the Renaissance. The Renaissance featured a new freedom to think and explore and ask questions and criticize, all of those things. So this is often called the Renaissance, 1400 to around 1600. The Renaissance paved the way for the Protestant Reformation in the 15 and 1600s. Protestant Reformation would never have happened without the Renaissance. In the Middle Ages, people had tried to break free from the Catholic Church, tried to start over again with Christianity, tried to start new movements. The Catholic Church was able to effectively shut all of those movements down. Some of them were very Bible-oriented movements. Some of them were pretty weird movements, but they were able to shut them all down. However, with the Renaissance and this new freedom to criticize and ask questions and this new restlessness with the power of the Vatican, that was the atmosphere in which Protestantism could break away, and that's exactly what it did. What was God doing during that time? Well, he was strengthening his church just as he promised. He was purging his church. He was disciplining his church. Colossians 1:23 says, "If you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven." So it's talking about continuing in the faith. It's talking about being established, and God was certainly establishing the church in Western society and eventually beyond Western society. All right, so what are some applications here? Things to think about and discuss. The church must be very careful with political power. The Bible doesn't forbid the church from having political power. It does counsel the church to be very careful with it, because power almost always provides the opportunity for corruption and for compromise. So the church has to be very careful with that. And that's something we need to think about. There are movements, even in our own society of getting involved in politics. And I don't think that the Bible ever says Christians shouldn't be involved in politics. But it's funny how during election season, politicians all want to come to the church. But when they're safely in office, they oftentimes ignore what the church has to say. It's an interesting dynamic. Churches must provide for the reality that people grow and experience God in different ways. I think monasticism was one example of that in the Middle Ages, that sometimes people do best when they're under very, very controlled circumstances. Other people do best when they're left alone. But we must understand that people experience God in different ways. Now, I don't mean that they experience God in ways that the Bible doesn't support, but just look around in our local churches. Some people are very, very into worship music. Other people, that's not a big factor in their lives. Some people are big Bible studiers. Other people, that's not a big factor. Some people are big active doers. They want to get involved and work with kids or work with the homeless or some other project. And other people, they just don't react that way. And we tend to want people to be involved in the things that we care about, and not everybody is going to do that. And then also, since we can't avoid conflict among Christians, we must work to handle disagreements in a godly way. Yes, we're going to have conflicts, sometimes very serious ones, but we need to make sure that we handle them in a way that is in love, and that's according to the way the Bible teaches us to handle conflict. Here's some more applications. Biblically guided education is an important key to cultural advancement and to general well-being of society. So the founding of the great universities by the church in the Middle Ages was a huge step forward for Western civilization and really for the world in general. We cannot underemphasize the importance of education with a Christian value system and with Christians guiding it. Now, I know Christians can be misguided sometimes and wrong-headed and all of that, but certainly it is better to have a system guided by people with biblical principles than not. And then the church must be prepared to adapt to an expanding knowledge of the world, always understanding that we don't have all the truth there is. We have some main principles, we have some revelation from God, but we can always learn things from other cultures as long as they don't contradict what we know from God's Word. So next week we'll do part 4 or session 4, the Reformation of the Church from 1500 to 1700 AD. It's going to be a great time. Look forward to being with you in that session. So this concludes this session, session 3 of the Panorama of the Christian Church. I need to say something about a group that's not exactly part of the Protestant Reformation. In fact, they preceded the Protestant Reformation by many decades, but they were not a successful group until much later. However, they still bear some noting. However, they still bear mentioning. It started with Jan Hus, who was a very popular priest in Prague in what is now the Czech Republic. He was known for his great intellect and powerful speaking skills. Long before Luther, Hus attempted to reform the Catholic Church. Hus attempted to reform the Catholic Church almost a century before Martin Luther's time. He objected to several key teachings and practices of the Church, such as having only a Latin Mass. He wanted the Mass to be in Bohemian or Czech for his people. He objected to the mandatory celibacy of clergy. In other words, he thought clergy should be able to marry if they wanted to. He objected to the sale of indulgences, which we'll talk about a bit later. And he disagreed with the doctrine of purgatory. He was called to the Council of Constance for his views, where he was tried and condemned as a heretic and then burned at the stake in 1415. Well, his followers banded together and called themselves the Unitas Fratrum, the United Brethren. They continued to preach, and they converted many people in Bohemia, what's now the Czech Republic, and surrounding regions. Later they were suppressed and driven underground for several hundred years by Catholic rulers. But in 1720, their descendants, now calling themselves the Moravian Brethren, migrated into eastern Germany onto the lands of a sympathetic nobleman named Count Nicholas von Zinzendorf. There they established a Christian community they called Herrnhut, and from there they spread their movement throughout Europe and into the Americas. They really were the first of the organized Protestants to do missions. So in a way they predate the Lutherans, although their movement was not open and free until well after other Protestant groups were established. You might call them pre-Protestants. So with that background, let's move on to Martin Luther and the Lutherans, who were the first successful Protestant group.